This video will show you how to replace your front power steering bellow boot on this Subaru Outback. This is part of your front steering and suspension, located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. We'll remove all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts. If you have a locking lug nut, you're going to want to make sure you have that key. Since mine does have the locking lug nuts, I'm going to be using that first. We'll just turn this until it feels like it wants to seat. Once it does, go ahead and turn that counterclockwise to remove it. Now that we have the wheel off, we have a clear view of our outer tie rod end and our inner tie rod end. We're going to start right in the middle here. This is where our 19mm jam nut is. As far as the jam nut, we want to be turning that clockwise, so it turns in towards the inner tie rod end and away from the outer tie rod end. Now as far as the outer tie rod end, it has a couple grooves here. You can see them along the top and the bottom. We're using an 18mm for that. 19mm for that jam nut, as I mentioned, and we're going to break this free. Now that we have movement from there, let's make our way to the outer tie rod end mounting nut next. Now, as far as this tie rod end nut is concerned, typically you're going to find that it's a castle nut and it has a cotter pin holding it in place. You're going to need to remove that cotter pin before you can remove the mounting nut. I'm just going to use some cutters. Let's get this out of here. You can see an ear of that right up along the top on my application. This can be pretty much anywhere. It really depends on where somebody set it. Now my cotter pin is rusted in place. This is extremely common. If that is the case, we're just going to cut the cotter pin and then we'll continue on with that mounting nut. We'll use our 19mm for that mounting nut. Once you have that off of there, just a quick inspection, and we're going to start it back on a couple threads. Now continuing on, we need to separate the outer tie rod end from our steering knuckle. To do this, we're going to cause vibration, and that should break this free. Once it does, it's going to drop down, and that mounting nut will prevent it from falling down and potentially hurting us. We'll hold that outer tie rod end, remove that mounting nut, separate the tie rod from the knuckle. Now if your cotter pin was lodged in there, you're going to want to remove it. You can do that using a drill bit or even a small hammer and a punch. I'm replacing this outer tie rod end, so I don't have to worry about that. We'll take hold of the outer tie rod end and we're going to turn it counterclockwise to unscrew it from the inner tie rod end. When you do this, count the amount of turns it takes to remove it and go ahead and write that down. 1, 2, and so on. Your results may vary. I had 19. As I mentioned, yours may be different. With the outer tie rod end out of the way, we're going to move along to our jam nut. We're going to remove that from the inner tie rod end. If you find that the inner tie rod end spins when you're trying to remove the mounting nut, you can use some locking pliers. As far as this outer clamp holding the bellow boot to the inner tie rod end, we're just using some pliers so we can remove that. Now we're going to use a small pick so we can make our way in between the bellow boot and the inner tie rod end. I like to use a little bit of lubricant here. I'm attempting to break this free. Make my way in between here. I'm not trying to cause any damage to anything. Just want to make my way around. Now that we've loosened this, we're going to follow the bellow boot inward. Now there's going to be an inner clamp. It's going to be fairly difficult to find it. On our application, it's up along the top towards the front, kind of at an angle. It could be pretty much anywhere. Once you do find that tab, we're pressing it in with a pick, and then we just need to go ahead and break this free. It's a single time use clamp, so we'll break it free, go ahead and remove it, dispose of it properly. While I have that pried up in an area I can gain access, I'm using a long pry bar and I'm going to tap on the very end of this. I want to try to break it free. There we are. We're just going to double check to make sure that the clamp did break free from the power steering rack and the bellow boot, and we'll continue on. Once we have that inboard clamp broken free, let's take hold of the bellow boot, we'll give it a slight twist and pull it away from the power steering rack and the inner tie rod end. Slide this off of here. There it is, friend. Now it's time to install our bellow boot. Since it's a tight area in there, I'm going to start my clamp on there. I'm just using a wire tie for this. We're going to keep it loose, we'll trim off any excess, but still leave a little, enough to be able to grab onto. Now we'll take that bellow boot and we're going to slide it over the inner tie rod end all the way to the power steering rack. We have to put the wide end of the bellow boot over the end of the power steering rack. We'll press that on there as far as possible. Now carefully reach inside that area, slide it onto the rack, and tighten your clamp or wire tie, whatever you're using. Now, of course, we just want to make sure we do have that onto the power steering rack as it needs to be, and I'm going to tighten my wire tie. For this, I'm just using some long nose pliers. I'll grab the ear of that. I should be able to twist it to snug it. We'll trim off any excess. Using some cutters for that. Try to get in here. There we are. Let's just double check to make sure that's secured in place. We'll continue on to the outer clamp next. Now we can install our outer clamp. If you're not reusing your original clamp, you can use a wire tie just like the inboard side there. Just go ahead and round it off, slide it over the boot itself, and then we're going to lock it down. We'll apply some anti-seize to the threaded portion of the inner tie rod end. I'm focusing where my jam nut's going to be. Once we have our anti-seize on there, we'll continue on with our jam nut. We're going to bring this down approximately 1/2 to 3/4 of the way, just enough that we can install that outer tie rod end the same amount of turns it took to remove it. We'll apply some anti-seize to this threaded portion of the inner tie rod end. Now let's install our outer tie rod end. One, 2, 3, and so on. We want to make sure we turn this in the same amount of turns it took to remove it in the first place. There's my 18 turns. As I mentioned, your results may vary. Now let's just take that jam nut. We're going to turn it counterclockwise, drawing it towards the outer tie rod end. We just want it to meet up here. Now we can start installing the outer tie rod end into the steering knuckle. As we bring this up, we're going to want to make sure we install our mounting nut along the top. Now, since I'm replacing my outer tie rod end, my mounting nut actually has a neoprene locker in there. This isn't a castle nut like we originally had. If you're reusing your original outer tie rod end, you want to make sure you tighten and torque it properly. Once it's torqued, we need to make sure that we have the port on the tie rod end aligned with the slots on the castle nut. If it's not lined up, continue tightening till the very next slot is, and then install your cotter pin. Get this tie rod end in place. We're bringing it up to the steering knuckle. Now we'll continue on with our mounting nut. I have a neoprene locking nut, so I do not have a cotter pin that I need to contend with. We're going to snug this up and torque it to 20 foot-pounds. If you find when you attempt to tighten the tie rod end nut, it wants to spin on you, go ahead and carefully use a pry bar underneath your outer tie rod end. We're prying up against our lower control arm, applying upward pressure. Snug that nut. Now we're making our way to the jam nut. We're going to turn this counterclockwise until it hits up against our outer tie rod end. We'll use a 22mm for the jam nut, and you can use some pliers if necessary to hold that tie rod end still. Double check to make sure your tie rod end is properly secured. One last inspection in this area and we can reinstall our wheel. Once you have that in place, you're going to continue on with all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. If you do have a locking lug nut, you want to use that as well. We'll start them on, snug them up. Get the wheel back on the ground, and the torque for each of these will be 90 foot-pounds. Now we have the wheel back on the ground, so we're going to torque these to that 90 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. The next thing you want to do is safely make your way down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.